1,000,000 machete-wielding peasants jammed the square before Cuba's national capital in response to the call of Fidel Castro for a celebration of the 6th anniversary of his 26th of July revolutionary movement. It is perhaps the greatest mass rally ever staged in the Western Hemisphere, a telling demonstration of Castro's sway over the Cuban masses. Showing another aspect of his character, the unpredictable Castro dons a baseball uniform to pitch a full inning in a benefit game for his agrarian land reform fund. His new president, Dorticos, tosses the first ball and the game is on. Castro pitching is credited with striking out the 3 batters he faces. Could be this one game where the ump really has to be careful. Viva Fidel!
Fidel Castro rose to power in Cuba by using his extraordinary gift of leadership. The power he gained would forever change the course of history through his near 50-year term. Born in 1926 in Biran, Cuba, Fidel Castro was raised in an impoverished family. From an early age, his classmates and friends knew that he had potential to one day be in a position of leadership. From 1952 to 1959, Fulgencio Batista was the dictator of Cuba. Under his reign, the economy was in a decline. Batista and his appointed officials were immensely corrupt. They used torture and execution against anyone who opposed them, specifically communists. Fidel Castro was outraged with his country's state. He wanted to advance and improve the quality of life in his country. Castro wanted to fight against Fulgencio Batista's reign. He joined revolution groups and eventually founded his own group called the Movement. After a failed attack in 1953, he spent years in prison where he shaped his goals and perfected his ideology from the readings of Cuban patriots Lenin and Marx and delivered his famous "History Will Absolve Me" speech. This speech called for the violent overthrow of Batista and his regime and the creation of a democratic system. Upon Castro's release from prison, he created the MR-26-7, or the 26th of July movement. In 1955, while taking refuge in Mexico City with his brother Raul Castro, Castro would meet Che Guevara, a Marxist-Leninist that would soon become a symbol of anti-culture movements, even in present day. While in Mexico, Castro would train his forces in the use of guerrilla warfare. Castro and his forces would return to fight Batista and would wage in about 3 years of guerrilla warfare, starting in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra and resulting in the overthrow of Batista and his regime.
La leçon de Victor Charlie, c'est que la réponse à la bombe atomique n'est pas une autre bombe atomique, mais la plus ancienne forme de résistance humaine, la guerre de guérilla. Nous avons demandé à Fidel Castro, qui connaît passablement la question, de nous dire comment et pourquoi la guérilla doit gagner.
Sobre la cuestión acerca de si la lucha armada es el único camino para la liberación, lo que puedo responder es que, por lo menos en las condiciones de nuestro país, no había otro camino. Y en nuestra opinión, en las condiciones de la inmensa mayoría de los países de América Latina, no hay otro camino que la lucha armada. Y esa parece ser la situación también en muchos otros países de Asia y de África. Por lo general siempre el imperialismo cuenta con todos los medios, aliado con las oligarquías de cada uno de los países, para impedir el triunfo democrático de la revolución. Y tiene atado a los pueblos por una especie de nudo gordiano, que solo se puede quebrar mediante la lucha armada. Además, el camino de la lucha armada no es el camino que hayan escogido los revolucionarios, sino es el camino que los opresores le han impuesto a los pueblos. Y los pueblos entonces tienen 2 alternativas: o doblegarse o luchar.
Castro used his influential and uniting leadership qualities to sculpt his visions into realities. After consolidating his power, he proved himself a brave new leader. Fidel Castro became a beloved figure in Cuba. During his reign, he successfully decreased racism and improved public health care, as well as improved literacy rates. Castro ingrained a sense of nationalism within the people of his country. He made private businesses government-regulated and encouraged Cuban self-reliance. Castro is accused of limiting political and economic freedoms in his country. he was an extremely powerful and influential force and got what he wanted when he wanted. When Castro spoke, no one else would speak. He was a moving, nationalistic speaker that had led his nation undoubtedly down the path of Leninist Marxist ideas. He inspired an entire nation from mountaintop to podium. As ruler of Cuba, Fidel Castro made extremely controversial Cold War decisions that affected the entire world. After he rose to power, he decided to cut all ties with the US and instead improve Cuba's relations with the USSR due to his strong communist beliefs. This completely changed the course of the Cold War. Castro's involvement with the USSR greatly affected the standpoints of the countries involved. This posed an immediate threat to the United States, and it increased the power held by the USSR. Fidel Castro had finally added Cuba to the list of communist nations. This addition became yet another defeat in the Western attempt to contain and diminish communism. Tensions and fear within the United States were increasing. The severity of the threat posed by Fidel Castro became known during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Fidel Castro decided to let the USSR put nuclear missiles in Cuba. It shocked the world and instilled even more fear into the US.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
This event was the closest the world has ever come to a full-scale nuclear war. This controversial decision posed a legitimate threat to the United States and made them realize for the first time in history that they were vulnerable to a nuclear strike. This move made by Fidel Castro and the Soviet Union left the US in a full-fledged panic. This bold decision eventually led to the removal of the nuclear missiles in Cuba and also in Greece and Turkey. When Fidel Castro took power in Cuba, it increased tensions within the United States. This was for multiple reasons. The first reason was that he was a communist who allied with the USSR in the Cold War. This meant one more country was lost to communism and therefore opposed to the United States and other Western nations. Cuba is also uncomfortably close to the US, at just over 90 miles off the southern tip of Florida. All in all, they became an obvious threat. There were numerous attempts to take out Fidel Castro led by the CIA. One of these attempts is known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a failure for the CIA as Castro and his army were able to easily suppress the attack. This humiliation of President Kennedy added to the struggle between the United States and Cuba. All friendly relations stopped with the Trade Embargo Act when the US terminated all trade between the two nations. US citizens were no longer allowed to even travel to Cuba. Although seen as a devil by many, Castro was able to accomplish many things within his nation. He improved the state of Cuba and made it much better than it was before. He was able to transform Cuba into a much more developed, modern country. Overall, he made important decisions that greatly affected the course of history. He redirected the Cold War and altered the playing field for both sides. Fidel Castro was a tremendously important leader who made a lasting impact on history.